we discovered that there were a couple of errors. And so if you got a map or bought one at some previous time, we have a little slip which will give the corrections to that we discovered at our last meeting. So, Siobhan, I think we need to, without further ado, we have a few people who are, this is also where some people are paying their dues, and so that's part of why we have so much activity over here at this table. So I will remind all of you, our year ends the end of this month, our fiscal year, so. Siobhan.
Okay. Jay? I would like to read all of Steve's numerous qualifications for speaking tonight, but unfortunately it is not going directly into my email that is on my phone. It goes in real well to my computer, and I wasn't paying attention to it until right now. So we have Steve Tejon. He is going to speak to us tonight about the Ft Tejon Ranch. And one of the pluses of having a granddaughter in your life is that you're always looking for experiences. And we had the opportunity to go up and visit the Ft Tejon Ranch as part of their 4th of July events. But Steve is, here, Janet gave me all of his criteria. She was able to get it on hers. Steve has a BA, and Mike, you will appreciate this, in anthropology from Cal State Bakersfield, and an MA in archaeology from the University of
Leicester
in the UK, and he served as an archaeologist for the U.S. Forest Service State Park and Caltrans. He returned to parks in 2007 as a park interpreter at Colonel Allensworth SHP.
State Historic Park.
Okay, boy, oh boy.
All right.
Acronyms I'm not familiar with. He was promoted to the Interpreter 3 position and served as the district's chief interpreter and Tejon sector manager until early 2020. Currently, he is the Cultural Resource Program Manager at the Great Basin District with California State Parks, and manages the cultural resources, the special events, the filming and concession programs. And it is just such an honor, Steve, to have you come and share with us this unique park. And so without further ado, we will have you come on up.
Okay, thank you.
Is that okay, or do I need to review the lighting? Okay.
Turn it on just for a minute until he gets figured
All
out.
right.
Okay, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. Yes, I'm the Chief of Cultural Resources for the Great Basin District of State Parks. And ironically, this month marks my 24th year with California State Parks. And I started working my first job for State Parks at Ft Tejon in 2000 after I left the Forest Service. So it's like kind of like coming home week. And I also live at the fort during the week. I have a house in Porterville where I commute back and forth to. But again, I'm also a registered professional archaeologist. I oversee 2 museum curators. One of them runs the Antelope Valley Indian Museum, an archaeologist, and then a park and rec specialist, which is a planner. So it's a very diverse program. We're always looking to expand. In fact, we're looking to hire a second curator at some point in the near future, and hopefully a historian as well. It just shows, you know, if you're really interested and committed to history, you can do a full-time job. I mean, Liv and Crew have been employed doing this for over 30 years doing archaeology. And if you have any problems hearing me, just, yeah.
Better, thank you.
Okay, just let me know how to use my outside park interpreter voice. Remember, if you take photos, get my good side on this side. Yeah? I know I have a bit of a hearing problem myself, thanks courtesy of Uncle Sam during the Cold War. But we're going to go ahead and get started. Fort Tejon and the Dragoons. The Dragoons that we're going to talk about. Well, let's back up a little bit. Okay, now the buttons are not working.
Is it not responding?
It's not responding.
Oh, hand it to me there,
Okay,
Steve.
try that.
Yeah, it should work now.
Okay. Technology is great when it works.
Still not responding?
No, it's not working. Let's try something else. All right, where is Fort Tejon? I get to ask this question all the time. It's located on the Grapevine on I-5, main route between the Central Valley and Southern California. Fort Tejon facts. First garrisoned in August 10th, 1854, was abandoned 10 years later on September 11th, 1864. At its height, there were over 40 adobe and wood structures on the post. It really was never supposed to be there. The lieutenant who was in charge of the detail to establish the fort was there at the bottom of the Grapevine, basically where all the shopping malls are today. And he said, heck no, let's go up the hill where it's a little cooler. And he said, this shall be Fort Tejon. And he established that because it was known as a traveler's rest. The regular U.S. Army operated the post until the start of the Civil War, and then the California Volunteers, the militia, reopened the fort from 63 to 64. Now, First U.S. Dragoons. That was the primary unit that was stationed there, although there were elements of the 3rd Artillery and a number of infantry regiments. And remember, this is a regiment, not a division. And it's a French word, and it means heavy horseman. Doesn't mean big fat guy on a horse. It means they were heavily armed. So they would have a musketoon, a saber, and typically a pistol or two. It's a lot like what our modern and mechanized infantry is today. Like when I was in the Army, I was a combat medic with the Army for about 6 years. I was in a mechanized infantry regiment, right? So we had wheels, we had grunt mobiles, right? And they would take us from place to place, offload, and then you would fight. Same concept. So they had horses, very expensive, according to the government, very expensive horses. And they would take you into the fight. They would get off and they would fight with their musketoon and or their pistols and the saber. Of course, even by 1847, if you drew your saber, you're in deep doo-doo, which means you were probably outnumbered and going to be overrun. So they were highly used, especially in this time period, based on experiences that Europe had during the Napoleonic Wars. And to quote a famous Southern general, who shall remain nameless, the theory was to get there firstest with the mostest, and you were going to win, right? Ah, there it works. They had all kinds of different accoutrements. Here we see the 1851-54 enlisted full dress. This is Sean Malis, old friend of mine. He was the park interpreter there for many, many years. They had a saber, cap box, frock coat, the shako. One of the things I want to note about the shako is this little pom-pom up here on top was orange. Now, a lot of times it would fade to yellow. And people thought, oh, they're cavalry. No. Dragoons were orange, cavalry were yellow. Mounted riflemen, I think it was green at the time, green or white. So they had colors for every branch, just like they do today. Like today, the infantry is blue, artillery is red, cavalry is yellow. Same thing. So there was a lot of pride in their branch. You can also see here the carbine sling. Now, a carbine sling is not like we think of today where you have a sling, put it on your shoulder, right? That's a rifle. The sling you wore across your body, it had a hook. It would slide up and down, and you would attach the rifle to the carbine, and the carbine went between your leg and the saddle. So whatever happened, if you fell off your horse, the carbine went with you, right? So it was actually a pretty smart setup. Actually, it was reinvented during the Iraq War, where people went to a single point sling where that rifle would not leave you, right? Same concept with a lanyard for a pistol. When I was a medic, I had to carried a sidearm, the old 1911, so it was always attached to me with a lanyard, so I couldn't lose it. Believe me, privates can lose anything. And then, of course, the field wear. This is the 1844 or 33 field jacket, shell jacket. It was very comfortable. It was much preferred over the frock coat because it allowed a lot of movement. The 39 forage cap, which was much preferred because it held up in bad weather. This is the cap you see during the Mexican War. A lot of Civil War units from the South had large stocks of these for their militia units. So you see this all the way through the Civil War. It had flaps that would fold down to protect your ears for cold weather, and then also in hot weather it could be substituted with a cotton fabric or linen. You see the haversack there, very common. This is very important. This is where you keep your food for the day. You would be issued rations, so your food would go in that haversack. That's not like for equipment, although I'm sure they carried some stuff. That was for your bread and your salt pork. Okay, and then of course the canteen. They had advanced to this very modern design of a canteen, sometimes called a bullseye canteen. Prior to this, they used a wooden one. And wood canteens are fine as long as you keep water in it. The minute you let it dry out, it shrinks and it will no longer hold water until you soak it again and the wood swells. So a tin-lined canteen, although not particularly flavorful, was a big advantage. And then of course we see the saddle. This is the Cadillac of military saddles. This is the Grimsley, the 1847. I've ridden on this saddle myself. It is very comfortable compared to the later versions, which is the McClellan. There's a couple other variations in it. And the reason is the McClellan, they found out, well, the saddle's too heavy. We want to reduce as much weight as possible, so they cut a hole in the middle of the saddle. So it's kind of like riding a toilet seat with leggings, right? So it's not real comfortable. This thing's completely covered with leather, and it's very comfortable to ride. You can see that there's the valets. This is very important. This is where all your stuff went, all your personal effects. Anything you want to take with you went in that. You might have a great coat, some other stuff. You know, your overcoat and blanket would be folded up here. You might have a little bit on the back. You have the holsters here. You would carry typically a lot of times a brace of pistols, depending on your position within the company. Extra shoes in case your horse threw a shoe. And actually, like I said, it's very comfortable. It's padded. It's very well done. It's probably one of the best saddles ever made for the military. And here's the primary weapon of the dragoon, the .47 musketoon. Basically, it's a cut-down musket. Right, self-explanatory, musketoon. And it's cut down to a very short length, not accurate, can't hit the broadside of a barn with it, so it's like shooting a smoothbore slug out of a shotgun, right, that's not rifled. And typically they would load it with what's called buck and ball, so you'd have one large caliber ball and 3 buckshot pellets. And the idea was to give you more chances of hitting stuff downrange, but the maximum effective range was like less than 50 yards, right? Not great, not great. It was worn and attached to the body. About 6,000 units of these were produced from 47 to 59. Although we see some of these show up again during the Civil War. There's a big scandal above General Fremont because he'd bought not this particular model, but the Hall carbine, which is the model before this. At an exorbitant rate, even though the Army had sold them to a private entity a few years before for pennies on the dollar what it actually cost. So during the Civil War, a lot of these got pressed into service until they get production back up. But we see a fair amount of these. Here's the model 1840 heavy cavalry saber, and it is very heavy. It's called, the nickname is the old wrist breaker. And a lot of times the soldiers would do this exercise. You would do daily saber drills, and you would hold your saber, and then you do a Milanese. Backwards, and then forwards, and then backwards, and then forwards to build up those wrist muscles. And one of the things that they would use also is they would use what's called a sword knot. You see sword knots today, they're primarily just ceremonial. And a sword knot is a piece of leather that would be attached to the pommel here, right in here near the riasco. It'd be buff leather. It would go around your wrist, right? And so when you're riding and you're using this weapon, it's attached to you. And the idea was you would ride along, skewer the bad guy, then grab your saddle, and once you grabbed your saddle, you would ride past him. The saber, being still in the bad guy, would spin him in his seat in the saddle and yank him off his horse. It took a lot of guts and a lot of skill to actually pull that off. So typically they didn't sharpen these things. It was used as a basically like a wrecking bar. So you would come up and you would hack at somebody, not intending to cut them, but you'd want to break their clavicle, because if you broke their clavicle, they couldn't ride. Right? They couldn't control the horse. They wouldn't have any strength in the body. And this is something they picked up during the, again, it was something that was learned during the Napoleonic Wars that transferred to America. You'd be surprised how heavy the influence was from France to America at this time. It was a requirement for most commissioned officers to learn French. They would learn French at the academy so they could read the latest military stuff in French, right? Anyway, we find historic examples we have in our collection where the scabbard here along the side is dinged, indented, and that was so the saber wouldn't rattle. It holds it in. There's really nothing holding this in other than the friction of the this part here against the throat. So they would ding that so it wouldn't fall out, but also so it wouldn't rattle as much. And then here's the standard pistol of the day, the 18 model 42, 54 caliber smoothbore. All of these things are like huge, huge chunks of lead. They're not moving very fast. So in order to make up for that, for the kinetic energy to hit, they would make the projectile bigger. So you see 64, 69, 72 caliber weapons are not unheard of or not unusual at this time period. It's about 14 inches in length. You'd probably do more damage by throwing it at them if they were more than 15, 20 yards away from you. I mean, I wouldn't want to stand downrange of one of these going off, but again, they were not very accurate. And the interesting thing is this little guy right here. This little lever, when you pull it out, swings. In fact, I think I have a picture of that next slide. Swings the ramrod directly in front of the barrel. And loading a muzzle and loading firearm on a horse while you're moving is almost impossible. Loading a muzzle loading firearm on a horse while it's standing still is difficult, because even when you're not moving, the horse is still kind of moving, right? It's like being on a ship. So the Army came up with this method to kind of help their soldiers load and load quicker. And when it works pretty well. Unfortunately, like most government contracts, right? You know, whenever someone says military grade, all those veterans kind of go, because that means it's just made by the lowest bidder, right? Well, it's not, a lot of times these, where it's brazed on right there, would bust off. So it wasn't always the greatest, and didn't always align like it should. It was just continued for the 1855 series because it just really, quite frankly, didn't work. The 1855 pistol carbine was another weapon. Again, it was 58 caliber, had a detachable shoulder stock, fixed ring for the carbine sling. They made thousands of these things. It was a great idea. Unfortunately, it was not very well executed. It's one of those ideas that looks great on paper. Practicality, not so much. Because even though it had a shoulder stock for stabilizing it, it's still a muzzle-loading arm. The bullet really didn't fit the barrel too tightly, so it didn't get a lot of gas behind it to make that projectile get the speed it needed. It did have this innovative device, and this is called what's called a Maynard type or Maynard tape primer system. And basically, how many of you guys remember the old cap guns where you had like the roll of caps, right? This is what this is, except it's in brass or copper, I don't remember which. I've seen original examples of this from time to time. You find them occasionally on the grounds at Fort Tejon. We do occasionally turn up something like this out of a rodent hole. And great idea. It didn't really work out as quite as good as they thought it was going to work out, right? So good idea, right? And this was to save time, so as you cock the hammer, it would advance that tape. It would have the, just like a cap gun, have the stuff in front of it, and would set off your charge. And again, used by the U.S. and Confederate troops during the Civil War, considered by many a good idea, but poorly executed. Again, lowest bidder, right? And then we get to the real meat and potatoes of the dragoons. What happened when these other arms became obsolete? Eventually, they replaced them with what's called the slant breech Sharps carbine. It's a 52 caliber. And this is where things really change, because now you have a breech loading carbine that is capable of actually getting out there and reaching and touching someone, right? So the effective range of this is like 300 meters or so. It's firing a fairly good size caliber bullet, but the Army wouldn't issue these until they wore out what they already had. It's just like the uniforms. Well, we're not going to issue the new uniforms until you wear out the ones you got, you know. Yeah, we have carbine at home. You don't need to buy one. So used a primer pellet, used a paper or linen cartridge, and that linen typically was soaked in a nitrate so that when the charge went off, it was all combusted, so it wouldn't leave any fouling in the barrel. Same thing with the paper ones. I've shot these myself, and they are very accurate. And one of the failings is typically because the metallurgy was not that great. Right here, you would start leaking gas after 400 or 500 rounds, right? After it really got worn in, so the wear out process was fairly short, or the service life, I should say. Although they were very accurate, and you know, as long as you were young enough to see the sights, because the sights are little bitty sights on it, they were very accurate. Then, of course, they built different models on it throughout the war, and eventually developed the Sharps carbine of fame, where it took metallic cartridges. Now in 1858, there was an incident on the Pacific Slope in Washington State involving the first U.S. Dragoons that were on detachment. And basically because the Indian tribes that they were fighting had full-on rifles. And they just had the musketoons, and they could not fight them because the Indians were engaging them at a distance where they couldn't shoot back. Kind of sounds familiar. Actually, this is what happened in Afghanistan to a lot of our troops, because the M4 was only good for about 200 meters, while a lot of the Afghanis were using leftovers from the British Empire, Lee Enfields, that were capable of shooting 500 yards, right? Same thing. And the Army said, oh, this is a problem. This is a real problem, because if they access to like rifles and Kentucky rifles, our guys can't shoot back. So they started issuing the Sharps. And they recalled all the musketoons, right? Sold them as surplus. Daily food rations. Now this is from the 1861 regs, but it's not that different from the 1850s rules and regulations. Beef, fresh, 20 ounces, or salted, corned, 20 ounces. Do you realize that most of the salted beef that came into the United States from about 1880 to about 1910 all came from Ireland, from one city in Ireland? But that's a little known fact. So you get 20 ounces of fresh beef salted. It was probably salted, or salt pork. Pork was preferred. It was seen as the premier food at the time because it had less chances of going bad, primarily. And then bread, soft, which is fresh baked bread, although that's kind of an oxymoron. There was rules and regulations in the officer's manual from this time period that said, never issue the men fresh bread, lest they become accustomed to it and not eat the stale bread when times are tough. So they would purposely bake the bread, let it go stale, and then they would issue it. Yeah, Army hasn't changed it. Hard bread, that's hardtack, right? Hardtack is basically an unleavened biscuit, giant cracker, although it doesn't taste anywhere near as good as a cracker or as soft as a cracker. It's very hard. The closest thing you can get to would be like, if you want to sample it, it'd be like pilot bread. Like, what's that brand? Sailor Boys pilot bread. If you've ever been to Alaska, that's a favorite up there. 12 ounces. And then if you were lucky, you got your ration of beans, desiccated vegetables. The troops used to call them desecrated vegetables because they would take these blocks of beans and peas and black-eyed peas and green beans and basically dehydrate them and compress them into a block with the idea that they could be broken off and made into soup at a later date. Yeah, not very appetizing. And then also you'd be issued coffee. 1.6 ounces daily ration of green coffee beans. Green. It's up to you to roast them, and if you're lucky enough you had a tin plate, you'd roast them over the fire. You and your buddies might club together and let one of you guys grind up the beans or crush it with a butt of your rifle and make your coffee. In fact, it's really interesting, if you look at the historical records, most Americans preferred tea. And really that change over to coffee comes around about the Mexican War in the 1840s, because the Army was too cheap to issue the troops tea. That was for officers. So they would issue coffee because coffee was cheaper. And you see this trend after the Mexican War. All these veterans go home and they want coffee. They don't want tea. In fact, we're going to get to it here in a minute. Captain Ralph Kirkham, I found some of his letters home, and he was a veteran of the Mexican War. He was stationed there at Fort Tejon. And he writes to his wife during the Mexican War. He was a newly commissioned lieutenant. I don't know what's going on. We can't get our rations of coffee. It hasn't caught up with us. The Mexicans drink this thing called chocolate, choco. I don't know what it is. I don't like it. Send coffee, right? I'm surmising. He didn't use those words exactly. But he didn't like what they had to serve down there. So, lower officers' quarters, Grapevine Creek. This was a test excavation I did 24 years ago. But we're going to talk a little bit about it. Here's Fort Tejon, Korea, 1885. Barracks number 1, barracks number 2. Here's the hospital. The lower officers' quarters would have been right here. The ranger station today is right about here. So we had a lot of hard pan, mixed modern debris. Layer B was the interior adobe, right? So telling adobe apart from just regular hard pan soil is not real easy. There's one telltale sign, and that's typically small particles of glass. They would use glass, probably broken up liquor bottles, to temper the adobe as it dried, right? Sometimes you'd use organic material like hay, straw, whatever. And then, of course, D was the, whoops, go back, was the main historic deposit, and then clay historic grade. That's basically what the grade was when the fort was active. And the part of the problem is where the officers' quarters is, the parade ground's upslope from it, so the entire parade ground will sheet and drain down and bring soil down into the creek, which is part of the reason why I had to do this excavation in the first place, because it was exposing some other deposits. So you can see when we mapped it out, it was almost all glass. And it's historic glass. Historic glass you can tell apart from modern glass, primarily because when it's exposed to sunlight over a period of time, it gets this dappling effect, so it turns purple or an amethyst color. And that's typically because the chemical composition of the glass is different than the glass today and when it's exposed to sunlight. You can also tell pre-war, like pre-World War I glass to post-World War I glass, and it has to do with the amount of cobalt that's in it. And actually, if you look at this, like at Allensworth, we have a couple of windows that are actually original to the buildings, and the windows at the bottom of the frame will be thicker than the ones at the top because over time the glass actually kind of slides down. You wouldn't think that, but yeah, that happens. So here's part of the remains is the exterior wall of the lower officer quarters. It was the home of Captain Ralph Kirkham and family. It was damaged during the earthquake of 1857 and later the residence of Lieutenant Samuel McKee. And the reason I know that is because I found Captain Ralph Kirkham's letters that was collected at West Point. He was a West Point trained officer. So I got to read through them, which is, you almost never get to do that in archaeology. That doesn't usually happen very often. Happens on historic sites, doesn't happen on prehistoric sites. So he was born to John and Betsy Kirkham in the town of Springfield, Massachusetts, 1821, graduated West Point 1842. Mexican War starts soon after that, so he's a fresh lieutenant. Met his future wife, Catherine E. Minks, while serving with the 6th Infantry at Fort Gibson, Oklahoma, or Indian Territory. I even found a photo of his wife, Catherine Minks, 1857. Lovely lady. Married 1846, served in Mexican War 46 to 47, distinguished him in battle. He got a brevet promotion. I like to talk about that a little bit. A brevet was a temporary promotion. It's like an acting, right? Because the Army only had so many slots for officers. We have 26 colonels, we have 14 generals, we have 100 lieutenants, right? And when you're in that slot, and you're in that slot permanently, that's yours until you die or you retire. Unfortunately, the rules for retirement were really kind of vague. So you would have generals and colonels that would stay on the payroll, weren't fit for duty, so they'd have a brevet that would fill that job for them in the field, and they would basically stay in that position until they died, because it really wasn't a retirement system. When that later gets fixed, you find a lot of these officers had been basically an acting colonel for like 20 years, but on paper they're still getting lieutenant's pay. So they eventually did fix that system. He had a wonderful reputation. He became the post quartermaster in 1855. He is the guy that actually designed and built the fort. And it's something to think about. In this period of history, Army officers were classically trained in that they learned geometry, they learned engineering, they learned everything you could possibly think of to be a fully functional officer on the frontier. He knew how to build a foundry in order to pour metal to make a bronze cannon, right? He would have to know that. He'd have to know the math behind it. He spoke and read Latin and Greek as well as French. So a classically trained man. He oversaw the construction of Fort Tejon, including the officers' quarters. He was promoted captain in 1856, which is really kind of unheard of, that quick of a promotion. And in 1857, they were living in the lower officers' quarters when the major earthquake, that is the big earthquake of 1857, struck on January 9th. And it was an earthquake so big, we don't know how big, there's no Richter scale. It's said that the Kern River flowed backwards for a period of time. It was felt all over the state. There was probably maybe a few thousand people in the state, a few 100,000 people, so the effects weren't widely felt. Not like today. Here's his boss. This is General Wool. He was the commander of the Department of the Pacific, so he commanded all the troops on the West Coast. And they corresponded with Lieutenant B.L. Beale, and he was not the Beale of the Beale Library or that guy, wrong Beale. But they corresponded back and forth, and we have a lot of this correspondence. In fact, we have one correspondence where the commanding officer of the fort had two positions. He was the post quartermaster and the commanding officer, and he would actually send each other, I need so-and-so for the troops. And he would send correspondence back and forth to show that he went through the process of doing this. And we have letters where he's arguing with himself, like he was really the supply officer and he was really the commanding officer with somebody else. And he was doing this basically to make sure that people thought he actually thought things through, apparently. There's a lot of graft and corruption in the 1850s and America in general, also in the Army. One of the things that the soldiers would do, or let me back up, the first sergeants would do with the help of the cooks. You got issued 20 ounces of bread. You never actually received 20 ounces of bread. They would give you 16 ounces of bread, and they would pull aside 4 ounces that would be sold on the open market, right? And that open market, that bread would be sold to the civilians around there on the open market at a profit. That profit would go to the company fund. Then the first sergeant, if he was honest, would take that money and go buy fresh vegetables from the local farmers. If he was not honest, went into his pocket, or he split it with one of the officers who might have been in on the scam. But that was very common in the Army. Also, there were no cooks. There were no designated cooks. You took turns being the cooks. Now, I imagine after a couple of rotations, you'd figure out who could cook and who couldn't, and so that guy would probably get the detail all the time. But generally, yeah, no cooks. So anyway, neat guy. He later, in 1857, they had their birth of the third daughter, Betsy, who died in San Francisco, aged 1 year, according to her headstone. The only reason I know that is I was in the ranger station, and one day this lady says, I found this headstone for sale at a secondhand shop in San Francisco. I thought it belongs here. And it's like, lady, thank you. So we eventually got that back to the proper spot in San Francisco. Tried to find that grave because someone stole it from the grave. And Betsy was the first child born at Fort Tejon, and the Kirkhams did raise 4 other children, Leela, Julia, Maria, and Kate. Kate later married a nobleman from England. I think he was like a viscount or baron or something like that. Transferred to San Francisco in 1857, where he remained for the rest of his life, with the exception of a temporary assignment to Fort Walla Walla. He also helped build Fort Humboldt in California at the Fort Humboldt. And before he retired, he was the rank of Brigadier General. He was in charge of shipping all the gold from California to the East Coast for the war effort during the Civil War. That's how high esteem everyone held Captain Ralph Finn. And the general died in 1893. Interesting character. So again, here's a picture of the fort. Here's what the fort looked like in 1859. So the buildings we were looking at just a moment ago, okay, let me get my bearings. Here's Officers Row. This building right here is now the officers' quarter. If you go to the fort today, you'll see this, and you'll see this barracks. Barracks number 1. Barracks number 1 is an original building. It was built in 1856. It's really built very, very well. We're going to get to some pictures of it. I've actually crawled around in the rafters. I did the historic structure report on that building about 20 years ago. There's no nails in it. It's all pegs, wooden pegs holding it together. All the joints are like doodad joints, so they all fit together on purpose, right? So it's not just pieces of wood slapped together. It's real craftsmanship when you see it. The officers' quarters were the same. These would have been kitchens and other outbuildings. This was the lower officers' quarters, the band. I don't know if I'd want to live next door to the band. The regimental band was quartered there, and then here's the hospital. Interesting thing about the hospital is all of the ammunition for the entire base was stored under the hospital. I don't think that makes sense to me. I'm not sure why I would do that. Probably not the best move, but they stored somewhere on average about 10,000 rounds of ammunition, paper cartridges, plus rounds for the howitzer. They had a mountain howitzer there. There's also the bakery, and then down here's the cistern, and there's a well. Then across what's the highway today would be the stables and all that kind of stuff. So here's enlisted men's barrack, what it looked like in 1914, and then in 1937, and then today. So we can see how it didn't really age all that well initially, and part of the problem was after the Army abandoned it, the Army never really purchased the property. They didn't have any legal right to the property. They were squatters. The land reverted to the Tejon Ranch, which at the time was owned by a man named Kip. I can't remember the last name. but it went through several owners. Most of the Spanish land grants, if the person went through the process and went through the courts, they got their land grants were adhered to. And when this was abandoned by the Army, the ranch took it over. And they used it. They used to store cows in here. This became like a barn, basically, for many, many years. And if it wasn't for concerned citizens out of Bakersfield and the surrounding area, it probably would have still been there. But there was this big move in 37 to 41 to make it a state park, to preserve it, the old adobes of Tejon, and they got together, they petitioned the government through the State Park and Rec Commission at the time as Parks and Beaches, and it became a park in about 1947, if I remember correctly. So here's a ground floor plan. It's a very simple room. There's actually a basement here. This would have been a storeroom. Room A would have been for non-commissioned officers. B and C would have been the primary. C is the primary room for the enlisted, and then D we call the first sergeant's room, and that probably would have been senior NCOs. So that would have been, well, first sergeants, ordnance sergeant, however the ranks were. They didn't really have as many ranks as we do today. It's like, they had private soldier, they had corporal, sergeant, and then they had a first sergeant. Room A, you can see elements of the original floor still there, and the fireplace. We actually have a restoration project that we've been seeking grant money for to do some restoration work on the fireplaces, so we use them. This has changed a lot since this photo was taken. Oops. We've added a bunch of displays, so if you go there today, you'll see all the different arms and accoutrements, the backpacks, the haversacks, the muskets, all that kind of stuff that are in this room now. This was under construction when I took this photo a number of years ago. And the barracks room, see, this looks pretty much like it looks today, and this is supposed to represent what the barracks would have looked like in 1856. So you see here along the wall, every man has a peg, right? Maybe one or two pegs where you'd hang up your clothing. Back in the day, you'd have a foot locker, right? And some lucky soldiers did have foot lockers, just like they did up through World War II up to the 1970s. But generally, they were like career soldiers, not your average enlistment. And you could enlist from 6 months to 2 years at a time, typically. You have your arms stacked in the center of the room, tables, and you can barely see it, but there's these little pads. Those are what's called a tick. A tick is a large piece of canvas stuffed with straw. 2 men to a tick. You would each get issued a blanket. One Army scratchy wool blanket, right? And that's your bedding. So you better hope you really like your buddy, because you're going to share a bed with them, right? And typical barracks life, you'd have checkers. They weren't allowed to drink. Enlisted men were not allowed to drink. If you got caught drinking, you could be punished. You could be flogged if it was a serious offense. Often you'd be what's called bucked and gagged. That is, you would be put on a split rail fence that looked like a horse with the sharp side up, and you'd be bound with your hands behind your back, and then you'd be gagged, and you might sit there for 6 hours. As soon as you got off the punishment, they'd issue you a thing of Hofstadter stomach bitters, which was made during the Civil War, from the Gold Rush all the way up to about 1940. And Hofstadter stomach bitters, which was supposedly really good for your digestion, and that's why they call it stomach bitters, was about 90 proof. It smelled like mouthwash, but during the Alaska Gold Rush, it was sold across the bar in shot glasses, so apparently it was effective. So yes, don't drink, that's bad for you, but here's some stomach bitters to help you through, And then, of course, this is the first sergeant's quarters, and here we see some, the valets. We have some cannon accoutrements. They did have a detachment of the 3rd Artillery that was there, and they had a mountain howitzer. 3rd or 1st, yeah. And most of the artillery at the time, they actually had more artillery regiments than they had guns for. So a lot of times they'd say, "Oh, I'm joining the artillery. You don't have to walk." Oh, guess what? Now you're infantry. You got to walk. So. And here's barracks number 2 as it appeared in 1937. And this fellow here, I can't remember his name, but he was doing what's called a HABS, Historic Architectural Survey Building Program. It was one of the big programs that happened during the Depression to save America's history. And if it wasn't for the Depression and the New Deal, this never would have got saved. He did just wonderful line drawings of all the buildings there that were existing. And then another view from that same time period. So you see there poor remains. And it's like an adobe structure is really tough, right? If someone was shooting at you, being inside Adobe is a good thing, right? Because it's 18 inches worth of dirt. Very well insulated. The barracks, when the fire's going in there, warm and cozy, it can be just snowing like heck outside. There's been times when at the fort, I've been there during the winter where we get a nice layer of snow, and I've walked from my house all the way down to I-5. There's no traffic out there. You can stand in the middle of I-5, no cars coming nowhere. It's great, it's beautiful, but it is very cold. Snow's off and on there 2 or 3 times a year, typically. But inside the barracks, if the fire's going, man, you're cozy as a bug. In the summertime, when it's 100 degrees on the parade field, you can go inside and there's like a 10-degree temperature difference, just walking inside. And that's with the windows closed typically. So Adobe is a wonderful building material for California because it typically doesn't rain as much. Well, the last couple of years excluded, right? It doesn't typically rain that much, but as long as you take care of it. And Adobe needs a good hat and a good pair of shoes. So if you got a good foundation, and all this foundation, you can't see it here, but on the building back here, is all local cut, quarried schist. So it's a very hard, dense stone. And as long as the roof's maintained, that Adobe will last for a long period of time. Now, one of the things you might be saying is that why isn't this coated on the outside? A lot of Adobes in California, you see it has that wonderful white plastering. Well, it doesn't because the Army was too cheap to do it. They had the troops to do it. They didn't want to spend the money to buy the plaster in order to do it. And Captain Ralph Kirkham said, you know, these are some of the finest buildings and homes I've ever lived in the Army, but they're the most poorly located because they got all of their supplies from San Pedro or from Santa Barbara, which meant troops had to go this long overland trip to get there to get the supplies, whereas if they were in San Diego, came right in on the harbor, right? Or if they're in San Francisco, came right in the harbor. And then, of course, here's the orderly quarters. This is one of our other existing buildings. This is what it looked in 37. I have actually, we're doing a restoration project on that. I have a 3D model of how it looks. These were added, oops. These were added sometime after 1940. These were added before 1930. I'm not sure exactly what's holding the building up. We're trying to figure that out. It's to do some restoration work on it so it doesn't deteriorate anymore. It's one of the oldest buildings in Kern County. Here's the post hospital in 1897. There's a, you may have heard of it, there's the Peter Lebec tree. There's the hospital ruins today. This actually was excavated by a good friend of mine for a master's dig. And there's a cistern, the bakery. I know we're running out of time. The guardhouse, which is reconstruction, the jail, and the Peter Lebec gravesite. There's an interesting story about them. Oh, poor Peter here has been dug up at least 2 times that I know of for sure. There was a group in 1897 called the Foxtail Rangers that came to the fort. They were vacationing there. And they said, there's a carving that says Peter Lebec is buried here. Well, let's find out. And so they dug him up. And supposedly they found a French franc that was minted the same year he was killed, 1837. And it's quite possible that the French were eyeing California as a possible move to get into their sphere of influence. Who knows? And then it happened again a few years later. Oh, I think Peter Lebec's buried here. Well, let's find out. So they dug him up. Now we have a grave marker. We don't dig him up anymore. I'm actually working with a group out of Florida to do some work. They're cadaver dogs to help us locate Peter Lebec. That's going to be our test. And we don't know where the military cemetery was exactly. We have an idea, but we don't know exactly. But without digging, we can use the cadaver dogs to help us find that. Ironically, I have a twin sister who's also an archaeologist, and she used it to find some prehistoric burials. And they were about 3,000 years old. So it's a wonderful program. So the officers' quarter used to look like, what it looks like today. This was completely rebuilt in the 1950s by a ranger who did it basically by himself over a period of years. Wonderful place. We have weddings, swearing-in ceremonies for re-enlistments, all kinds of things happen there over the years. We have the dining rooms during the quarters. We've had film shoots come in and do film for like the History Channel, stuff like that here, for generic history. That actually is real. That actually is a real wolf that was killed at Fort Tejon back in the 1850s. And then for living history, we do a lot of living history out of here, out of the kitchen. We've had some of the best meals I've ever had was cooked in this hearth. We had a volunteer who was really like a Food Channel diva, right? So she did all this cast iron baking, and she would make our meat and cheese puffs and apple pies and all kinds of stuff. Not exactly historic recipes, but I'll allow it. Had a great time. So that ends our presentation. I know we're short on time because you got some other stuff you got to do, but if you guys have any questions. Yes, sir.
I noticed on the gravestone, Lebec was spelled with a K.
Yes.
So is the old gravestone more accurate than the sign I see on file?
We have no idea. Back then, most people weren't as literate. It's like my last name is Tomey. It's spelled P-T-O-M-E-Y. That is a clerical error from a clerk at Valley Forge. I had an ancestor at Valley Forge. His name was John P. Tomey. The P was a middle initial. It got slid over the last name, and since his Army retirement or pension was in that name, he kept it. So spelling errors happen. History's messy. Because most people is like, how do you spell that? I'm just going to call you Don, right? It happened at Ellis Island all the time. I suspect that's probably what happened here. But that's what's carved in the tree too. So, but then again, it was carved by some mountain men. So, who knows? Yes, sir.
Does the home park, is it just the fort, or is there more land associated with?
Good question. Yes, the park was originally like 40, 50 acres, but we actually have some backcountry now that we acquired over the years. It's like 1,200 acres now or something like that. So if you go past the campground, there's a road that leads in the backcountry, and we actually are working on adding some trails back there. The downside is there's a range there that we use for our rangers, but also the CHP uses it, and CHP uses a lot. They use it a lot at night when they don't tell me when they're going to use it either too, so that's a whole nother issue. But yes, there's more property, and we are looking at expanding more opportunities for recreation. Did you have a follow-up?
And on that property, I've heard there's some Indian petroglyphs. Is there any way that the public can get access to looking at those?
Yes and no.
Yes.
That's a complicated question. We would have to find it and evaluate it and then deem if it was capable of having the public there to view it without damaging it. And then we'd have to work with our tribal partners because of AB 52 that recently passed. We have to consult with all of our tribes that are in that area. And if we were going to show them or speak in a Native voice or talk about Native Americans, they have to buy into it. So but there is a state park that you can visit called Tomokani State Historic Park in Tehachapi. It's a 1.25 mile hike in, but it is the most spectacular rock art you're going to see in this area. It's called a place called Creation Cave. In fact, I just took a group up there Wednesday. Yes, ma'am.
What sorts of events and schedule do you guys have up there now?
Well, it's posted on our social media and our webpage. Typically, we have second cows, like the second Saturday of the month, where they reenact what actually happened at the fort. The Fort Tejon Historical Association, which is our cooperating association, our friends group, currently they don't have their contract, so their stuff is kind of on hold until they kind of get their act together and file all the paperwork for their 501(c)(3). They had some issues. Then they could go back to having the Civil War event and the Peter Lebec ghost. There is a third party going to hold a ghost hunting event there in June, but she's charging like $65 a head or something like that. So, but that's again, State Parks is open to having third parties come in and do events for the commercial value, provided it doesn't incur or damage the history. So,
Are they doing a 4th of July celebration?
they'll probably do one, but that'll be done by park staff rather than by the association. So it probably won't be as big because we can't buy food. Yes, is there one over here?
Civil War reenactment?
They still occasionally do that, but again, that's done by the association, and it has to do with them gathering up the reenactors and taking out the insurance and all that kind of stuff. We don't really do battles, and that because of our own internal policies, we can't do force-on-force demonstrations with black powder. In fact, that's a big issue in state and national parks with handling of black powder. There's been some incidents like at Fort Ross where a volunteer burned a significant portion of his hand because he was mishandling powder, even though he'd been doing it for years. So, but then he didn't report it to anybody until it like fell off. Any other questions? All right, thank you.
Thank you, Steve. The park is open for visitation, however, is it not, Steve?
Yes, every day.
And there is an entrance fee.
Yes.
What's the entrance fee?
There's actually it's a parking fee, and I think it's $6.
$6?
Yeah.
per car, so.
Per car. It's still a value.
It's a huge value, and it is a fascinating place just to go and look, even if they aren't doing the various reenactments. It's just fascinating. So if you get up that way, it's not a big investment.
Well, and if you're a veteran, if you're a disabled veteran, there's a distinguished veterans pass which gives you free days and free camping. It's a lifetime pass. There's also a National Park Service pass for any veteran, whether you're disabled or not. It's good in all national parks and all federal lands. And then there's also a senior golden bear pass that you can get. That has to be renewed every year.
Again, thank you, Steve, very much. I think we have time for Siobhan to do her little installation of officers, because technically, per our bylaws, we are supposed to install officers at this meeting. And so I will again turn the microphone over to Siobhan.
I'm not nearly as worried about our bylaws as I am about Mac's time schedule. And so I have until 6:30, and I have begged for 6:30 and a half, and he is in agreement on that he will be flexible. So if somebody can wave to me at 6:29, so I don't go over. So Mac, that being said, I'm going to have you come up here first. And I know you're not an officer, but you are a gentleman. And one of the fun things about having grandchildren is back in the olden days, we drew pictures in the dirt, finger painted on the wall and that kinds of things. And my grandsons have a new laser printer. And so we were playing with it. And so they did an emblem of the Kern Antelope Historical Society for us on one side. And this says videographer Mac on the other side. So when he is sitting at his desk, he can point out to this side so everybody knows who he is, and he can have the beautiful picture in front of him. In this, we have got pencils with erasers because Mac is a perfectionist. And everything is done and redone to the nth degree, and I know you need lots of erasers there, my dear. I may get 631 out of them.
Thank you, Jerry.
Our next non-officer is Mike. And Mike, I'm going to have you come up here.
Make sure you tell everybody who Mike is.
Well, I'll tell everybody who Mike is in my terms.
Okay. All right.
Mike is our free, which is really important for a volunteer society, digital master. And Mike has taken and he has highlighted all of the things that are important to the Historical Society in a digital manner, Mike. And we just cannot say enough about how much we appreciate the time way above and beyond what you have given, beyond your master's degree internship, and that you have done this out of love. You know, you're sure enough not getting rich off of us. And so we really, really appreciate you highlighting and showcasing our town. And then, of course, no officers would be remiss without having a president. And in our case, Gretchen is our president, and she is multilingual, and she can speak red, black, blue, green, and she keeps us on our toes in every way, shape, and form that you could ever imagine. And I'm going to tell just a quick side note on Gretchen. There was a woman in Lancaster who saw her at the post office, and she went up and she asked Gretchen a nonsensical question. You know, I mean, have you ever gone up to anybody in a town you're unfamiliar with and said, do you know of a place I can rent? Gretchen commands this universal knowledge. Everybody assumes that she would have an answer to whatever question they would ask. And they did. And she did have an answer.
And the lady is renting Siobhan's Airbnb place.
Yes. From Escondido to the Lancaster Post Office via Gretchen. And then Dolores Julian is our vice president. And if you've ever had the chance to watch someone's attention to detail, you will see it in Dolores's penmanship. And she loves nothing better than a fine pencil. She has
With a good eraser.
With a good eraser, and these are brand new erasers. If I'd been really ornery, I would have stuffed it full of the back of a lot of old envelopes for her to have something to write on. But she is our detail-oriented person and keeps everybody on their toes. And then Janet is our treasurer. Oh, whoops, sorry, our secretary. Which means Janet probably in some ways has more freedom and more responsibility than anybody else. And so Janet gets to paint the world with her own beautiful colors, and she creates our beautiful newsletters every month. And she, like Mac, has developed a lot of patience with my way of doing things at the very last minute. And so I just really, really appreciate it, Janet. And then Kelly, where are you? You don't
I don't need to get up.
You don't need to get up.
Good.
But if you notice, there is only one Kelly. However, though, there are two people to replace her as treasurer, and that's Shar and Lori. And so if we could have you two ladies come up.
Hey, sure.
Kelly, I don't know what it's supposed to tell you. It's okay.
Let's see if we're trainable.
Yeah. And Shar and Lori's job, it's real easy. It's a two-color job. It's to keep us out of the red and in the black. Okay? So it's not complicated. So there you go. Uh-huh. And then the three of us are directors at large. So if I could have Terry and Judy come up and join me. And a director at large kind of gives you lots and lots of freedom. You get to do a lot of what you want, and you get to say no to a lot of what you don't want to do. And so we get to kind of color outside the lines and decide to do what we'd like to do, but we also only color in pencil in case Gretchen or Dolores or somebody wants to come back and say, ooh, that's a really bad idea. So Judy, there you go. There you go here. And Terry's really needed an apron on the side, but we'll share that information later. Am I on schedule?
You have 1 minute.
Oh, I've even got a minute to spare.
Siobhan needs to give one to herself.
I do have one for myself. I had bought enough of the pencil boxes to have one to screw up. But my grandsons were so good at this that there was no screw up, so I got one too. So.
That's very good. And I don't know, Max, should we do a swearing in like you usually do?
Well, you're not going to be an officer if you don't.
All right, so would all of the officers and board members please stand? This is Max's official swearing in ceremony.
Everyone please raise their right hand. I state your name. Have been duly elected, state your office. And as such, I promise to do what I'm supposed to do. You are now official.
Thank you. For those of you that don't know, Mac is a retired Superior Court judge, so we are sort of official by doing this. Thank you all for coming. We have to be out of here, and it takes Mac a while to break down. So I will say good night, and I hope to see you in June.
We've had some buzz on Facebook about people being really interested in the buildings down at the bottom of the Tropical Gold Mine. And so we are going to have the film of Glenn Settle actually talking about each of those buildings. So please pass the word around. It's a great opportunity for everybody that's wondered about that.
Yeah, and I'm so glad that we have them on film and that we have Glenn talking about them, because as you know, if you've been out there, the buildings are becoming rubble rapidly. So this is a really good thing that we were able to get this. And again, see you then, hopefully in June. Thank you for coming.